Vivien Ashford's SUV died on a mountain road with no warning, just a cough of steam and the slow lurch of a vehicle that had decided it was finished. The nearest town was 40 minutes back, the lodge was 30 minutes ahead, and the vote determining whether her father's company survived with her name on it began in under 2 hours. Her phone signal flickered between one bar and none. Roadside assistance said 3 hours minimum. Then a battered Ford pickup came around the bend and stopped, and the man who stepped out did not recognize her face at all. If you want to know why a piece of her father's missing past was hanging inside a stranger's truck, stay until the end of this story. The man who stepped out of the pickup was not what Vivien expected, though she could not have said exactly what she had expected. He was somewhere in his late 30s, unhurried in the way of someone accustomed to problems that required patience rather than panic, wearing a jacket that had clearly been repaired at the pocket once and not repaired again. He looked at her SUV the way a person looks at something that can be understood rather than mourned. He did not look at her with recognition, which was itself unusual enough that it registered. Most people who encountered Vivien Ashford in a professional context had already formed an opinion about her before she spoke. This man had none. He walked around the front of her vehicle, crouched briefly near the wheel well, stood, and asked if she was all right before he asked anything about the car. The question was plain and without performance, and it caught her slightly off guard. His name was Dane Holloway. He told her that much when she asked, after he had established that the SUV was not going anywhere on its own without parts that were not available on a mountain road. He was quiet in the particular way of someone who had learned that silence was more efficient than filling space with words. Vivien, who spent most of her professional life in rooms where everyone spoke constantly and meant very little of it, found that quality both foreign and unexpectedly steadying. She told him she needed to reach a lodge about 30 miles north. She asked if he was heading in that direction. He said he was. She asked if he could give her a lift. He looked at the time on his phone, and something moved briefly across his expression, a small internal calculation she could not read, before he unlocked the passenger door without ceremony. Vivien Ashford had not ridden in a vehicle this old in many years. The seat was worn smooth along the edges, the dashboard held a faint smell of motor oil and cold coffee, and the interior had the particular honesty of something that had been used hard and maintained carefully rather than replaced. There was a thermos wedged between the seats, a small duffel behind the driver's seat, and a paper map folded on the dash that had been refolded so many times its creases had gone soft. None of it was calculated to impress anyone, because none of it was trying to. Vivien settled into the seat and watched the mountain road unspool ahead of them, and reminded herself she needed to be calm, focused, and fully prepared to walk into the most consequential boardroom of her career in approximately 90 minutes. She was thinking about the vote, about Gideon Blackthorne's coalition of friendly board members, about the 3 independent seats she had been quietly working to hold for the past month, when the truck hit a stretch of uneven pavement and something swung forward on its cord and caught the afternoon light coming through the windshield. It was a small thing, silver, round, hanging from the rearview mirror on a length of thin cord that had gone dark with age. The motion made it turn, just slightly, just enough. Vivien stopped thinking about the vote. She had been 7 years old the first time she saw that compass. Her mother had given it to her father on a morning Vivien remembered mostly in fragments, the smell of coffee, her father's laugh, the small silver disc that her mother had pressed into his palm with both hands like it was something fragile. Her father had held it up to the window so the light caught it, and then he had shown Vivien the engraving on the back. The initials first, then the words. He had read them aloud to her, and she had memorized them the way children memorize things that feel important without yet understanding why. He carried it for years. She had not thought about it consciously in a long time, but seeing it now was not a gradual recognition. It was immediate, complete, and physical in a way that made her breath go short. The left edge was bent, a small dent, a deformation she remembered because she had once dropped it as a child, and her father had told her the imperfection made it easier to tell which way was home. The cord was different, the compass itself was not. Vivien sat very still for a moment. Then she said, quietly and carefully, that she wanted to ask about the object hanging from his mirror. Dane glanced at it with the ease of someone who has forgotten something is there because it has always been there. He said it was his father's. He said it the way people say things that are both true and also not the whole truth, not because they are hiding anything deliberately, but because the whole truth is longer than the question seemed to require. Vivien asked him where his father had gotten it. Dane said he did not know exactly. He said his father had carried it a long time. Vivien told him that it had belonged to her father. The words came out steadily, which surprised her, because what she felt in saying them was not steady at all. Dane's eyes moved to her once, a brief, assessing look before returning to the road. He asked her to say that again. She did. She told him about the engraving. She described the dent on the left edge. She said her father's name. She said, Everett Ashford, and she watched something shift in Dane Holloway's face that she had not seen shift in any face in any boardroom in all her years of running the company her father had built. It was not guilt. It was not surprise exactly. It was something closer to recognition arriving later than expected, the expression of a man who had been waiting, without quite knowing he was waiting, for a particular door to open. He asked her if Everett Ashford was her father. She said yes. He was quiet for several seconds. The road curved and straightened. Then he asked her something that made no sense until everything that came afterward made it make complete sense. He asked if she had ever heard of a woman named Mara Kessler. The atmosphere inside the truck had changed, and both of them could feel it, though neither named it directly. Vivien asked Dane to explain what he knew. He told her that the compass had come with his father, Russell Holloway, for as long as Dane could remember. He had grown up with it in the house, then in the garage where Russell worked, then eventually in his own truck after his father passed away. Russell had never told Dane the full story of where it came from. He had only ever said, once, in the kind of offhand way that turns out not to be offhand at all, that the compass did not truly belong to them. He had said it belonged to someone who would eventually come looking for it, or someone who deserved to know where it had been. He had not explained further. Dane had been younger then and had not pressed. By the time he was old enough to understand that the remark had weight to it, Russell was gone. But Russell had been deliberate. He had left behind a sealed wooden box, not large, nothing dramatic about its dimensions, with a letter attached to the outside addressed to Dane. The letter said that one day someone would contact him regarding a man named Everett Ashford, and that when that contact came, Dane was to bring the box to wherever he was directed and deliver it in the presence of a woman named Mara Kessler. Russell had written that the contents were not Dane's to open, and that they were not Russell's to have kept forever. He had written that he had made a promise, and that the promise needed to outlast him. Years had passed. Nothing had happened. Dane had kept the box in a cabinet in his garage, had not opened it, had occasionally wondered if the whole thing had been one of those instructions that make perfect sense to the person who leaves them and never quite resolves for the person who inherits them. Then, 3 days ago, a phone call had come from a woman who introduced herself as Mara Kessler, retired corporate attorney, formerly of a firm whose name Dane did not recognize but Vivien immediately did. Mara had told him she needed him to bring the box to a meeting. She had given him an address. Vivien asked him to say the address. He did. She recognized every word of it. It was the address for Ashford Summit Lodge, the same lodge she had been attempting to reach for the past 2 hours. The same lodge where, in approximately 75 minutes, a board of directors was preparing to vote on a deal that would, if it passed, deliver the operational heart of her father's life's work into the hands of Gideon Blackthorne. Dane had not known, when he agreed to make the drive, that the box was connected to anything currently happening at that lodge. He had not known that the woman he picked up on the side of a mountain road was the CEO of Ashford Engineering. He had thought he was fulfilling an old, quiet obligation on behalf of a man who could no longer fulfill it himself. The understanding of what he had actually walked into settled over him visibly, a recalibration of the entire situation. Vivien watched it happen and recognized it because she had felt something similar about 30 seconds earlier. She told him she was not a company employee. She told him she was the CEO. He absorbed that. Then he looked at the box behind his seat. She asked if she could open it. He told her his father had been clear. The box was not to be opened until Mara Kessler was present. Vivien, whose professional instinct was to push forward through every obstacle by direct force, sat back and said she understood. Because she did understand. Whatever was in that box had survived 16 years intact because someone had been careful. She was not going to be the one to break that carefulness with 90 seconds of impatience. They drove the rest of the way to the lodge with the compass swinging gently between them and a sealed box sitting behind the seat, and 16 years of unanswered questions filling the space where ordinary conversation might otherwise have lived. The lodge came into view around a wide curve, its timber facade pale against the dark tree line, its parking area lined with vehicles that announced, without any subtlety, that the people inside had arrived from somewhere else and intended to return to somewhere more important. There were vehicles Vivien recognized. There were drivers standing near a few of them, which she also recognized as a signal of the particular class of person who liked to be seen having a driver. Dane pulled the pickup into the far end of the lot. With the straightforward logic of someone who parks where there is space rather than where the space means something. He had barely stopped when the passenger door opened and Vivien stepped out, and the effect of this on the cluster of board members and company executives near the lodge entrance was immediate and specific. Several of them looked at the truck. Several of them looked at her. One of them looked at both, and could not quite reconcile the two. Preston Blackthorne was younger than his father and wore his confidence more visibly, which made it more fragile. He crossed the lot toward Vivien with the expression of a man who had already decided the shape of the day and was experiencing minor irritation at a deviation. He looked at Dane with the economy of a person who assigns category before they assign identity, and the category he assigned was immediate and dismissive. Vivien watched Preston's eyes move from the truck to Dane's jacket to Dane's face, and arrive at a conclusion that she found both predictable and clarifying in what it revealed about Preston's actual intelligence. She did not correct the conclusion, not yet. Gideon Blackthorne's reaction was different. Gideon was standing slightly apart from the group near the entrance, and he had the composure of someone who had spent decades in rooms where composure was currency. He was watching Dane in the particular way of a man who has just seen something he did not expect to see and is choosing, with considerable professionalism, not to show it. But Vivien had spent years watching Gideon Blackthorne in rooms, and she knew the small geography of his expressions. And what she saw in the 3 seconds before his face resettled into its familiar warmth was something she would not have been able to name precisely, except to say it was not welcome. It was the opposite of welcome. It was the expression of a man who has spent a long time being certain that a particular thing was gone, and who has just discovered it is not. When Dane introduced himself by last name as Holloway, the minor disturbance in Gideon's composure happened again. It was brief, and it was controlled, and it would have been invisible to anyone who was not specifically watching for it. Gideon recovered instantly, moved to Vivien's side, spoke quietly about the schedule, about the board's patience, about the wisdom of setting aside distractions before a consequential meeting. He was careful not to say Dane's name again. He was careful not to look at the truck again. Vivien filed all of this. She asked Gideon, with the neutrality she had been practicing since she was 26 years old, whether he recognized the name Holloway. He said he did not. She thanked him and excused herself. Mara Kessler was inside. She was 70, possibly older, with the particular bearing of someone who has survived a great number of meetings where people tried to minimize her and has long since ceased to find that either threatening or interesting. When she came through the lodge door and saw Dane standing in the parking lot, she stopped for a full second before continuing forward. She looked at his face and then at the box in his arms, and then she said something that Vivien heard but that Dane had not been expecting. She said, "Finally, Russell kept his word." She said it quietly to herself, but not so quietly that it was not meant to be heard. Then she looked at the box and said that Everett had prepared its contents against the possibility that Gideon Blackthorne would still be standing inside a room that bore the Ashford name. The account Mara gave was not brief, and it was not organized the way testimony is organized, in clean cause and effect. It came out the way things come out when someone has been holding them carefully for a very long time, and finally has both the reason and the permission to set them down. 16 years before the afternoon at the lodge, on a night of heavy rain that had turned the mountain highway into something treacherous and unreliable, Everett Ashford had been driving alone. He had come from a meeting with Gideon Blackthorne, the kind of meeting that ends badly and that the person calling the meeting pretends ended well. Everett had been in the middle of an internal audit that he had not announced formally, had not disclosed to his board, and had not discussed with anyone in the company's legal department, because the legal department reported to a structure that also reported to Gideon. He had been looking at transaction patterns. He had been looking at the way certain licensing agreements were structured, at the way royalty flows moved between entities, at the names of the companies receiving the most favorable terms. What he had found was not conclusive, not the kind of evidence that survives a court process, but it was the kind of pattern that a person who had built a company from nothing recognized immediately as a system designed to move his company's value into someone else's hands, slowly enough to be deniable. His vehicle had developed a problem somewhere on that road, mechanical failure that announced itself with grinding and smoke, and he had managed to coast to the edge of a service area where a small garage sat under a single light. Russell Holloway had been there. He had been working late on a customer vehicle, and he had come out into the rain without being asked because that was the kind of person he was. He had looked at Everett's engine, had told him the truth about what it needed, and had told him the truth about how long it would take. Everett had sat in the garage's waiting area and had received several calls that told him things he did not want to know. He had understood by the end of those calls that the materials he had been carrying in his briefcase, printed copies of the financial patterns he had been documenting, were not safe to bring back into the building. He had not been certain of the mechanism. He had not known exactly how or when something might happen. But Everett Ashford was a man who had built a company by trusting his instincts about structure, and every instinct he had that night was telling him that the documents in his possession were at risk of disappearing if he carried them anywhere connected to Blackthorne's reach. He had looked at Russell Holloway, who was covered in grease and telling the truth about timing without any political calculation behind it, and he had made a decision. He had taken the compass from his jacket, not dramatically, simply as something that would identify the nature of what he was leaving. He had given Russell the sealed envelope, the small notebook, and the compass, along with instructions that were precise and simple. Keep these. Do not open them. If Mara Kessler contacts you, do as she directs. He had given Russell a phone number. He had told him that he hoped he would never need to use it, but that if it became necessary, Russell would know. He had shaken Russell's hand. Then he had driven away in a vehicle that was technically functional and arrived home before midnight. He had died 3 months later. A cardiac event, unexpected, the kind of thing that happens to men in their 50s who work too many hours and believe they will have more time. The death was not suspicious. There was no conspiracy. But the death meant that the documents he had been intending to formalize never reached a formal process. Mara, who had been his attorney and who had known approximately what he was building toward, had been removed from the company's legal representation structure within 8 months of his death, replaced by a firm more favorable to the new balance of power on the board. She had not forgotten. She had waited. She had tried once, years later, to contact Russell, and had been told that he was ill and that the timing was not right. She had waited again. Then Russell had died, and she had needed to find Dane, and finding Dane had required more time and more caution than finding Russell. And by the time she had found him, the proposed acquisition was already on the board's agenda, and the timeline had compressed to something urgent. She had called him 3 days before the meeting, because 3 days was exactly as much notice as she could give, and still have him there on the right morning. Vivien sat with all of this for a moment. She understood the logic. She even understood the trust. But the feeling underneath the understanding was something rawer, because what it meant was that her father, in the last difficult months of his life, had trusted a man he met once in a rainstorm more completely than he trusted the institution he had given his life to build. She said this aloud, not as an accusation but as a fact she was trying to process. Mara let her process it. Then Mara said that Russell Holloway had been trustworthy precisely because he had no stake in the outcome. Every person inside the company who might have held those documents had something to gain or something to lose depending on what was in them. Russell had nothing to gain and nothing to protect except a promise. That was exactly why Everett had chosen him. Dane set the box on the table in the small meeting room Mara had reserved. He stepped back. He had no proprietary feeling about what was inside. He had carried it carefully and delivered it intact, and whatever it contained was not his. Mara produced a small key, which she had been holding for 16 years. The box opened without drama. Inside were 4 items: a handwritten set of notes in Everett's recognizable, precise script, dense with observations about transaction structures, company names, and dates. A collection of photocopied agreements, some with annotations in the margins, and some with passages underlined. A handwritten ledger page comparing royalty rates across several agreements, with 2 figures circled and a question mark beside them. And a sealed envelope with Vivien's name on it, written in her father's hand, the ink slightly faded but completely legible. Vivien did not open the letter immediately. She set it aside and looked at the other documents first, because that was what the moment required. The notes her father had written described a system, not a fraud in the simplest sense, but a structure. A series of licensing agreements in which Ashford Engineering's foundational technology, the proprietary engineering systems that represented decades of development and billions in accumulated value, were licensed to third parties at rates significantly below market. The third parties were not independent. They were connected through layers of holding structures and intermediary companies to entities controlled by the Blackthorne family. The arrangement meant that every year, a percentage of the actual value of Ashford's core intellectual assets flowed away from the company and into Blackthorne-adjacent structures at a price that bore no relationship to what those assets were actually worth. Vivien looked at the proposed acquisition agreement that Preston had been circulating for the past 6 weeks. She found the subsidiary schedules. She found the licensing terms buried in the 3rd addendum. The rates were not identical to the ones her father had flagged 16 years before, because the specific numbers had been updated. But the architecture was the same. The mechanism was the same. The same families of companies appeared with different names, but traceable ownership. The deal Preston had been presenting as a straightforward strategic acquisition was, at its core, a transfer of the most valuable thing her company owned, at a price structured to look reasonable while moving several $1 billion worth of compounded future value into Blackthorn control. Dane was standing near the window, not looking at the documents, not inserting himself into the interpretation. He was watching the road through the glass in the uncomplicated way of a person who is not performing patience, but simply has it. Vivien looked at him for a moment before she said what she had found. She told him the deal on the table now was a continuation of the pattern her father had discovered. She said it more to herself than to anyone, working it out by saying it. Dane turned from the window. He said, with a plainness that cut through everything she had built up around the moment, that she needed to be careful about how she brought this into the meeting. He said that if she walked in there talking about her father's suspicions from 16 years ago, she would be framed as someone acting from grief and personal history rather than business judgment. He said the documents were tools, not arguments. The argument had to be built from what was provable in the present, not from what her father had feared in the past. Vivien looked at him for a long moment. She said that was correct. She said it with a specificity that indicated she meant it, not as a social grace, but as a genuine assessment. Something shifted between them in that moment that was quiet and not small. She had been alone in rooms with people who wanted things from her for so long that she had largely stopped noticing the specific quality of her aloneness until something offered a contrast. Dane Holloway was not trying to get anything from the situation. He was not trying to position himself relative to the outcome. He was not calculating what helping her might eventually yield. He had driven to the lodge to return something that did not belong to him, and having done that, his interest in the proceedings was limited to the basic human decency of not wanting to watch someone get hurt by something he could see coming. That was the entirety of his investment. In the context of everything surrounding Vivien in that building, it was extraordinary. Gideon found Dane outside on the terrace while Vivien was reviewing the documents with Mara. It was not an accidental encounter. Gideon Blackthorn was a man who had spent 4 decades constructing situations, and the conversation he initiated with Dane Holloway was constructed with the same quiet expertise he brought to board resolutions and acquisition structures. He began by establishing common ground, acknowledging Russell's competence, expressing what sounded like genuine respect for a man who had worked honestly and without pretension. He said that Russell had been a good person, and that Dane appeared to be one as well. He said that good people sometimes found themselves in situations that were more complicated than they appeared from the outside. He said that the world Dane had stepped into at the lodge that afternoon operated by rules that were not visible until you had spent decades learning them, and that a person could easily cause damage without intending to simply by not understanding the stakes. He said all of this with warmth and apparent concern, and if Dane had been less perceptive, it might have registered as concern. Then Gideon made the offer. He said it plainly, which Vivien later acknowledged was the smartest approach, because it could be characterized afterward as a straightforward business discussion rather than a pressure campaign. He said there was a loan outstanding on Dane's garage, and that the terms of that loan could be resolved. He said there was a figure, a number he named specifically, that would be sufficient for Dane to secure his daughter's future in a way that his current work made difficult. He said these things would be available in exchange for a simple acknowledgement that Dane had acquired the box from an estate sale and could not vouch for the provenance of its contents. He said there was no shame in taking a practical path. He said that Dane had fulfilled whatever obligation Russell had intended by showing up, and that no one would expect him to understand the full implications of documents produced during a complicated period in corporate history. He concluded by saying that men like Dane and men like Gideon were not so different in what they wanted: stability, a future for the people they were responsible for, an end to uncertainty. Dane heard all of it. He let Gideon finish. Then he said he was not going to do that. He said it without heat or spectacle. Gideon's tone shifted only slightly, but in a direction Dane had anticipated. Gideon said that Dane needed to understand what he was choosing to involve himself in. He said it with the specifically calibrated condescension of someone who has deployed it professionally and knows its effect. He suggested that Dane's presence at a board-level corporate proceeding was a category error, that whatever Russell had told him, he was not equipped to navigate what was happening in that building, and that the kindest thing anyone could do for him was help him understand the scale of his mistake before it became costly. Dane said he was not there to change anything belonging to Gideon. He was there to return something that did not belong to him. Then he went back inside. Vivien was in the hallway near the conference room entrance. She had heard the last portion of the exchange through the terrace door, which she had not fully closed when she stepped out to find Dane. She had heard Gideon's offer. She had heard Dane's refusal. She had heard the final 2 sentences. She did not say anything about it when Dane came back inside. She did not need to. The fact of what he had done settled between them as something that required no words, and she let it settle. Mara had spent the preceding hour in quiet consultation with one of the board's independent directors, a woman named Clara Weston, who had been appointed 2 years earlier, and who had, in Vivien's experience, the clearest independent judgment on the board. Clara was not affiliated with the Blackthorn position. She had reviewed the documents with a focus that was professional and unhurried. By the time Vivien walked into the conference room, Clara had formed her assessment. The meeting convened. Gideon opened the session with his customary authority, the comfort of a man who had run this room for many years and believed he understood all of its variables. Preston presented the acquisition summary with polished fluency, the kind of presentation that has been rehearsed enough that it sounds natural and moves fast enough that the weaker structural points do not invite extended examination. Several board members asked questions that were largely confirmatory, the questions of people who had already decided and were providing cover for their decision. 2 members who had previously indicated support for the deal asked questions that were notably more precise than the week before, and Vivien recognized in their precision the effect of Mara's quiet work with Clara. Vivien did not lead with the history. Dane had been right about that. She opened with the present documents, specifically the subsidiary licensing schedules in Addendum 3, and she walked the room through the valuation gap between the rates offered to the Blackthorn-connected entities and what the market for comparable technology licensing had established as standard. She used numbers. She named the entities. She showed the ownership connections. She did not use the word conspiracy. She said, structural conflict of interest, undisclosed related party arrangements, and material undervaluation of core intellectual property. Preston interrupted twice. The second time, Clara Weston asked him to allow Vivien to finish. When the historical documentation was introduced, Mara presented it as corroborating pattern evidence, not as the foundation of the case, but as proof that the structure Vivien had identified was not an oversight or an error in the current agreement. It had precedent. It had architecture. It had been identified once before by the company's own founder and never addressed because the founder had died before he could address it formally. The room was quiet in the specific way. Rooms are quiet when people who have been following one script realize the script has changed. Preston moved to discredit the source. He said the documents were unverified, of unknown provenance, produced by someone with no standing in the proceeding. Clara asked Dane to come in. He entered. Preston looked at him with the particular expression of someone who has already decided that what they are seeing is absurd. He said, without quite managing to keep the contempt out of his phrasing, whether the board was now expected to take the testimony of someone who repaired vehicles as grounds for blocking a billion-dollar transaction. Dane said he was not offering testimony. He said he was making himself available if anyone had a question about the chain of custody of the documents. He said the documents spoke for themselves. He said he was just the person who brought them. The answer was precise and it was exact, and it left Preston with no surface to push against, because attacking the messenger when the messenger has explicitly declined. The role of messenger is a maneuver that damages only the person attempting it. The board voted to suspend the acquisition pending an independent financial and legal review. The motion to remove Vivien from the CEO position was introduced by Gideon, seconded by one of his allied members, and failed at a count of 7-3, with Clara's vote and the votes of the two members whose questions had sharpened over the preceding days providing the margin. Gideon did not raise his voice. He did not make a scene. He sat through the vote, and then he became very still, and Vivien watched him understand, in the way a person understands something irreversible, that the alignment of the room had changed in a direction he had not anticipated and could not immediately correct. The members who had been reliably in his column began, one by one, to address their remarks to Clara and to Vivien rather than to him. It was not dramatic. It was simply the ordinary human behavior of people adjusting their orientation toward the most stable point in the room. Gideon's power had not been broken by confrontation. It had dissolved by information, precisely as Everett Ashford had apparently believed it eventually would. After the meeting concluded, after the other participants had dispersed into the lodge's corridors and the parking lot, and the particular relief of people who have been present for something consequential and are now free to leave it, Vivien found Dane at the far end of the lot, the pickup's tailgate down, sitting on it with the kind of posture that belongs to someone who has completed something they were obliged to complete and is now simply existing for a moment before returning to their actual life. She walked across the gravel. She asked him, directly, why he had kept the compass on the mirror rather than in the box with the rest of his father's things. He told her that Russell had been specific about the box, but had not included the compass in it. He had given Dane the compass separately on a different occasion, without formal instruction, but with an observation that Dane had carried for years without fully understanding. Russell had said that Everett Ashford had spent the last years of his life losing his way in the noise of work and money and opposition, but that the compass had been the thing that reminded him of what the noise was for. He had said that when you lose the reason you started something, the work becomes a way of protecting the work, rather than a way of protecting anything that matters. After Russell died, Dane had put the compass on his mirror because he thought about that observation sometimes in the early mornings when he was leaving for the garage and June was still asleep, and the reason for the work felt very clear and the work itself felt very long. He had put it there so he would see it and remember which one mattered more. He reached up and took it down. He turned it over once in his hand. He set it on the tailgate beside Vivien. She picked it up and turned it over and read the engraving she had not seen in 16 years, and she felt the small dent at the left edge, and the feeling that moved through her was not grief exactly, or not only grief, because it was also the feeling of something arriving that had been in transit for longer than it should have had to be. She stood there for a moment with it in her hand. Then Dane told her he thought it had found its way home. She did not say anything for a moment because there was not anything to say that was better than the quiet. She opened the letter that evening in her car before she drove back to the city. Her father had written it by hand, on paper from a small notebook, in the space of a few minutes on a rainy night in a garage, which meant it was not the letter he would have written with more time and better circumstances. It was the letter of someone who understood that the time and circumstances he had were what he had. He had written about the company briefly and practically, confirming what he suspected and where he had put what he had found and why. Then he had written about her. He had written that he had been absent in the ways that men in his position were frequently absent, that the work had expanded to fill the space that could have held other things, and that he had told himself he would correct the imbalance later, which was the kind of thing people tell themselves when they are not ready to correct it yet. He had written that he was proud of her before listing any specifics, meaning that the pride was not conditional on the specifics, which was something Vivien had not known until she read it. He had written that the company was a structure, like all structures, contingent and replaceable, and that the thing it could never replace was the person she was when she was not defined by it. He told her that if she ever reached a point where holding the Ashford name to a building cost her something essential about herself, she should let go of the building. He said the name was hers regardless of who held the deed. She sat with that for a long time. The mountain road was quiet. The compass was in her hand. The letter was in her lap. She understood that her father had not been a man without fault, had not managed to do everything he intended to do, had run out of time before he finished. She understood that the gap between what people mean to do and what they actually do is sometimes closed by others, and sometimes by time, and sometimes by 16 years, and a mountain road, and a stranger with an honest face. She folded the letter and placed it with the compass in the pocket of her jacket, close, which was where it belonged. Several weeks later, on a morning that was overcast but not cold, a car turned into the lot of Holloway Garage on the edge of town. It was newer than anything that usually parked in that lot, though it was not the most expensive thing Dane had seen in the area. He was under a vehicle when he heard the tires on the gravel and came out expecting a customer with a specific mechanical problem and a flexible timeline. Vivien was standing next to her car, holding 2 cups of coffee, with the specific directness of someone who knows what they are doing and is not performing uncertainty about it. She handed him one. He took it. She told him her car was running fine. She told him she owed him something closer to a real conversation than what the past weeks had allowed. She told him she had been thinking about something he had said in that small room in the lodge about the difference between building a case on the present and building one on the past, and that it had changed something about how she was thinking about the next phase of what the company needed to become. She said all of that without making it sound like a business pitch, which meant she had practiced it enough that it had become honest. He noticed the compass on her rearview mirror before he said anything about why she had come. The silver was the same. The dent at the left edge was the same. It caught the gray morning light coming through the windshield the same way it had caught the afternoon mountain light weeks ago, but from the right side this time, because it was hanging in a different truck from a different cord, in the life of a different person who had decided it was worth carrying. He didn't say anything about it. He drank his coffee. She told him she only had about an hour before she needed to be on a call. He said an hour was fine. They walked inside. The garage smelled of clean metal and old wood, and the particular honest smell of work done by hand, and neither of them said anything about where anything went from there, because it was morning and the coffee was still warm, and some things do not require deciding in advance.